It certainly does sound like a warning. Advisors to Ukraine's president say more war is coming to Russia. This follows another day of drone strikes on central Moscow and retaliatory drone strikes on the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. In what Russia called an attempted Ukrainian terrorist attack, a building in Moscow that houses several ministries was struck by a drone for the second time in 3 days. The facade of the glass tower was damaged, but no casualties were reported. Russia accuses Ukraine of carrying out the drone attack. Ukraine did not claim responsibility. Well, in a separate incident, Russian drones attacked the city of Kharkiv in Ukraine. One drone struck a dorm at an educational institution and partially destroyed it. More drones damaged a building and a sports facility in another part of the city. The buildings were empty at the time of the strikes. Mark Kansian is from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he joins me now from Arlington, Virginia. He's also a former U.S. Marine colonel and has written extensively on military strategy. Such a pleasure to welcome you back on the show. Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky said at the weekend that the war was coming to Russia. Do you think that we have seen in the last couple of days can be interpreted as a turning point in Ukraine's military strategy, or is this mind games?
I think this is mostly mind games. It's not a turning point in military strategy. The Ukrainians have struck Russia and Moscow in the past. It looks like they're stepping that up. Maybe they've been able to produce more of the drones that can reach Moscow. I think they're sending a message to Russia that their capital, their cities will not be safe if the Ukrainian cities are not safe. And there's probably an element of vengeance in it. But these are pinpricks. It's all psychological. It's not going to change the course of the war. The war is going to be decided on the ground, on the battlefield, with the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Mm-hmm. Now, what could potentially change the course of the war would be a decisive response to these kinds of attacks by Russia, something that they have pledged that Ukraine is going to see. They have said so repeatedly. We haven't seen anything of the likes, but is there a danger that these drone strikes could lead to an even greater escalation of the war, possibly in the form of tactical nuclear weapons even?
I think nuclear weapons are extremely unlikely. Russia has put down a red line saying that there would be no invasion of Russian territory, but these kinds of drone attacks clearly don't count as an invasion. If the Ukrainians tried to push their troops over the border and capture some Russian cities, I think then that would be much more dangerous. I think you're going to see more of this battle of the cities. We saw that, for example, in the Iran-Iraq war. We saw it in Second World War. One side attacks the other side cities. The other side responds by attacking the first side cities. And I think that dynamic may go on.
Mm-hmm. We're always talking about Ukrainian drones, and Ukraine has promised to only use the modern Western weapons that have been put at its disposal to defend its own territory. What would happen, though, if it used them to strike in Russia?
Well, it's possible that the Russians would try to escalate, but I doubt that that would be the case. I think the United States and NATO have been pretty firm with Zelensky that they don't want these weapons used that way. And I think if Zelensky overturned that trust, it would be a serious discussion between the countries. NATO and the United States have allowed Ukraine to use these weapons to attack Crimea, which they don't regard as part of Russia. Mm-hmm. We saw the Skystorm attack bridges, for example, in Crimea.
Let's look at the counteroffensive, because that is, of course, still going on. Ukraine has now deployed reserve troops. What does that tell us about the state of affairs?
Well, the counteroffensive is not going as well as had been hoped. We're almost 2 months into it, and the Ukrainians are still in the Russian defensive zone. They have not broken through. Last week, it looked like they might have been able to do that, but they were pushed back. The Ukrainians are bringing in probably their last set of fresh troops in order to try to get a breakthrough. The good news is that they have not culminated, to use a military term. They have not run out of steam. They are still moving forward. They are still attacking, and it's possible that they could achieve a significant success still.
how decisive will the coming months be for that, the months before winter arrives?
Every phase of the war is decisive in its own way. The next month or two are going to be important because we'll see how the Ukrainian counteroffensive comes out. It's unlikely Ukrainians can go more than 1 or 2 more months. Offensives like this run out of steam. The troops get tired. The equipment gets attrited, gets damaged. If the Ukrainians are still hung up in the Russian defensive zone, you'll see a lot more talk about negotiations, about an armistice. And that will be very discouraging, I think, to supporters in the West that the Ukrainians haven't made more progress.
That was Mark Canty. Always great to get your point of view. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Mike Martin is with us now. He's a security analyst at King's College in London. Welcome back to DW. Now, the fact that reserve troops are being sent into battle, what does that tell us about the state of the counteroffensive?
Well, I think it's actually quite a good sign. Up until now, the best way to characterize the counteroffensive is slow and steady. The first phase, they broke through some of the initial Russian lines, but then hit up against the main lines and didn't get through. And now we've seen a slight uptick, and the deployment of the reserves means that they actually have something to deploy them into. So one hopes that in the coming weeks we'll see some movement in the lines.
Yeah. In terms of military and human losses on the one hand and territorial gains on the other, you just said slow and steady, but what do you make of how successful this counteroffensive has been so far?
Well, I think initially, as I said, the Ukrainians threw themselves into the Russian lines, and quite quickly they realized that those lines were more extensive, and particularly the minefields that the Russians had laid were more able to repel the Ukrainian attacks. So as you said in your package, they've switched to hitting logistics, but also critically, they've started taking out Russian artillery pieces. And the Russian rate of artillery loss is at the highest at the moment than it has been throughout the entire war. And so what I would say is that this is broadly what we would expect in terms of overall equipment loss from Ukraine and perhaps from Russia as well. There is some time still to run for this offensive from the Ukrainians.
How much time?
Well, they really have to get this done in 4 months. And the reason they have to do that is because once we get into Christmas, really, the landscape becomes very, very difficult to fight. And soldiers are concentrating more on keeping alive because the temperatures are sub-zero. And so over the next 4 months, we need to see some considerable progress from the Ukrainians.
Okay, what would success look like? What would be considerable progress?
So I think there's really 2 options. There's the gold option, which is if the Ukrainians break through the Russian lines and get through to the Sea of Azov. So that cuts the Russian forces in 2. That would be a storming, absolutely fantastic success for the Ukrainians. If they're not able to achieve that, then what we might call a category B success might be the retaking of Bakhmut and the extension of those lines in the east, or perhaps taking a major settlement or surrounding a major settlement like Melitopol in the south. So that's kind of halfway to the coast from where the front lines are now. So really there's sort of 2 options depending on how far they're able to go.
What would happen if Ukraine did not reach these goals that you just described?
Well, I think that becomes problematic, largely for political reasons. So in 2024, we have the US presidential election. Some of the runners and riders in that are not that pro-Ukraine. They're certainly not pro-arming Ukraine. And I think, more broadly, if we look at European countries, they have given a lot of equipment and training to Ukraine. And they've done it willingly and happily because Ukraine is sacrificing as well. But if there is no progress, they would like to see, to put this in kind of rubbish business speak, they'd like to see a return on their investment. And if they keep pouring equipment in and the Ukrainian forces, with great sacrifices that they're making, aren't able to produce the goods, then that will become problematic next year, I think, for Ukraine politically.
What would it mean militarily before all of that kind of unfolds? Because the Russians did use their time wisely this winter. Can we expect this to if the counteroffensive does not come to fruition in the next 4 months, that the Russians will make it even harder for the Ukrainians to bounce back next year?
Yes, I think that's right. So there have been information has come out of Russia that leads everyone to believe that there will be another mobilization of troops in September. Now, these are the annual mobilization, the conscription mobilizations in Russia. But of course, they can decide whether they want to just raise 50,000 people or 400,000 people. And it seems like they're going for several 100,000 troops. And that's more than anything else. Russia it won't be able to deploy them this year, but it will be able to train them up, get them to the front lines for the beginning of next year. And then that makes Ukraine's job much more difficult.
A decisive time for Ukraine. Mike Martin from King's College, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us.
Thank you.